in the 1970s also, you had films like Choti Si Baat, Baaton Baaton Mein, which simply described the lives of people going about their daily routines.
A song like Rim Jhim Gire Sawan, with Amitabh walking on the roads.
The revenge that the coal exacts for having been mined.
In the 90s, I remember a book called Rapidex English Speaking Course was a runaway hit.
That's right.
Kapil Dev would promote that book and say, Rapidex da jawab nahi.
Yes, I agree that there was a phase when the urban and the hyper-urban took pole position, as it were, and eclipsed all other sorts of narratives.
Hello and welcome to Likhawat. I am Gautam Chaubey, your host, and this is a show about the books of Bharat. Today, let's start with a question. What is it that a novel seeks to portray? If you were to ask a novelist and demand a one-word answer, she would say it portrays evolution, growth, the evolution of a nation, of a community, of a character, of a conflict, of a dilemma. But no narrative of evolution is quite as magical, quite as enchanting as that which seeks to celebrate the growth of a child. And of those narratives, very few are as lyrical, as soulful as our book of the week, A Speck of Coal Dust by Rohit Manchanda. Professor Rohit Manchanda spent his childhood in the coalfields of Jharkhand and did his doctorate from the University of Oxford. He is a professor at IIT Bombay, where he teaches and researches computational neurophysiology and writes fiction. His first novel, A Speck of Coal Dust, won a Betty Trask Award for the year 1995. Set in coal country, it follows Vipul, the preteen son of a mine manager, as he awakens to the oddities of existence in a remote world marooned in time. Vipul finds in his surrounding much to marvel at, to recoil from, to love and to cherish, as a melange of characters including capricious teachers, a comics-loving swami and tinpot rogues float into his life and out of it. Manchanda's second novel, A Place and Mind, as yet unpublished, won a Tibor Jones South Asia Prize. His recent novel, The Enclave, is set in Mumbai of late 2000s and captures the social and cultural mores characteristic of the era. Professor Manchanda has also authored Monastery, Sanctuary, Laboratory, a history of IIT Bombay. Joining us today in the studio is a celebrated novelist, the author of the book, and a professor of bioscience at IIT Bombay, Professor Rohit Manchanda. Professor Sahab, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Gautam, for that very warm welcome and for having me here in the first place, because I've looked with great admiration at this show in the past.
The book is deeply autobiographical. It's a vivid portrayal it's a vivid remembrance of things past, and I grew up in those parts myself. It's set in Jharkhand, the coalfields of Bihar and Jharkhand, and therefore I could identify some of the obscure fictionalized references in the book. इस पूरी किताब पे आपके बचपन की छाया है, हर जगह उस बचपन की छाप है. What was it like growing up in Jharkhand, in the coalfields of Bihar and Jharkhand in the 60s and the 70s?
Thank you. Yes, it's something that strikes me as being somewhat surreal. When I look back upon it, I can't quite believe that I had the sort of childhood that is portrayed in this novel, A Speck of Coal Dust. And the reason is that for one thing, so much water has flown under the bridge for me personally, and the other is that places of this kind and zeitgeists of this kind, the spirit of the times was so very different from how it is now that it seems to belong in another universe entirely. Of course, if you look at remote outlying regions of states such as Bihar and what is now Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh and so on, they even today will seem to be completely out of place, out of sync with so many other parts of the country, let alone other parts of the world. But in those days, the disjunction used to be a lot more radical, a lot more severe. So for instance, even though I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, as you said, very many of the hallmarks of that time and place made us feel as if we were living in the 30s or the 40s. And for instance, I've described in the novel how the newspaper used to arrive 2 days late. And unless you listen to the radio, very often you couldn't catch the radio broadcasts in these absolute hinterland areas where the coal mines were. You would be actually looking at the world as if from a distant star where the light was reaching 2 days later.
By the 90s, the time was reduced to 1 day later.
That's right, and the time was reduced, and that was sophistication, that was advancement, and so forth. Also, of course, the setting. The coalfields, I think, are very little spoken about, very little written of in literature. And one of the reasons that I wanted to write about them is because they had such great peculiarities, as I think, again, you'll concur. They're a one of a sort kind of environment, where you have scenes that you can't see anywhere else because of what goes into coal mining, the pit heads and the dredges and the pontoons and so on and so forth. They make for a landscape that is, again, somewhat surreal in its nature. So when I look back on that time, I feel that the spirit of the time, the landscape of the time, and we'll, I suppose, get to talk about that, the sorts of people that one used to encounter at the time in those settings were all so singular, so peculiar, to use peculiar in the way of novel and unique and so forth, that I think that sort of world never existed anywhere else, even at the time, and now would be just a figment of the imagination, lost to history perhaps.
The novel is set in Khajuri, a place called Khajuri, and the protagonist is an 11-year-old boy, Vipul. Something which brings to mind works like Malgudi Days, Pathir Panchali, or to the extent that things unfold from the perspective of a child, even a book like Manu Bhandari's Aapka Banti. But in spite of all these similarities, इस किताब का वर्गीकरण, classification बड़ा मुश्किल है, whether to call it children's literature or adults literature or Bildungsroman, बड़ा मुश्किल लगता है. ऐसा क्यों है?
I'll prefer to take that as a compliment. Thank you, Gautam. I suppose it's because I did not have any premeditated outlook on what I was going to write when I started writing the book. The book was an exercise in just going back, partly from nostalgia and partly from a desire to escape the circumstances I was in at the time, to just fly back to the times of my childhood, relive them, inhabit them, and also try and recreate them. So I started writing in an effort to recreate that time. And of course, I wished to fictionalize it. I knew that I wanted to write stories and a novel perhaps. So what I wanted to do was to also transform the sort of reality that I had encountered. And if I were to just report it as it happened, well, that would be reportage, that would be journalism of a kind. So part of the whole process was to also let my imagination wander around a bit and then see if I could bring to the paper the kind of experiences that I had had, which, as I say, seemed to be rather odd, rather bizarre at times. And also, to, if I'm not using too grand a word, to immortalize, to try and immortalize that time and place, which I already knew when I was starting to write this novel was vaporizing.
But revisiting, not being a reportage, using your imagination, you've in fact looked at it more closely, the way I see it. I mean, the very details of the landscape that evade your attention, spent passages exploring them. Can you reflect a bit on that?
Yes, and again it's to do with the fact that both at the time that I was there and later on when I used to go back to it in memory, I used to think that these were really sometimes very bizarre landscapes, very striking and one of their kind. And then when I started to write about either those landscapes or the experiences I had amongst them, I found that I couldn't but linger on them in order to evoke them. So one of the ways I felt that an evocation of place or time could be best done was by pausing for a moment or two at a certain point and describing it as fully as one could without perhaps becoming tedious about it. Now, for instance, there is this episode in the very first chapter of the novel where these boys are hunting for mosquitoes, and that goes on and on. It goes on for about a couple of pages. Now, I felt that the only way I could do justice to that sort of, again, rather outre activity that one used to indulge in was to linger on things like even the smell that a mosquito gives off when it's been crushed in the palm of your hand. Now, how do I capture that? I need to stop there. I need to not rush on with the narrative, but take a deep breath, try and recall exactly what that smell is like, maybe do a fresh experiment, if I may put it that way, and then capture the kind of feeling and the kind of smell and the kind of sight that the imprint of a dead mosquito lives on the palm of the hand. So part of the exercise was to fictionalize, but also to evoke with as much sensuality as possible.
Right.
What a boy would be going through in that sort of place.
I see that in your portrayal of the river Damodar.
Yes, that is one of those passages. You are absolutely correct. And in fact, one of those passages where I again linger on the sensation that thunder shower can produce. There's auditory sensation, there's visual sensation, of course, but there's also somatic sensation. The haptic, pure haptic sensation of raindrops falling on you and what that feels like, and your shirt being pressed against you by the wind and what that feels like, your hair being blown back and what that makes you look like, and so forth.
Look at coalfield narratives. Usually they follow two trajectories. It's either a site of mafia and gang war, जैसा कि Gangs of Wasseypur film में होता है, or it's a site of labor struggle, as we see in a novel that I have in mind, सावधान नीचे आग है by Hindi novelist Sanjeev. आपने एक तीसरी धारा चुनी है जो बिल्कुल अलग है. It's a place of magic, it's a place of wonder, as you were mentioning, the very queasy act of smacking a mosquito dead. It acquires cosmic proportion. So tell us about your narrative choice.
The films that you mention and the book, I think they are masterpieces in themselves. When I set out to write this book, I also very consciously knew that I did not want to write about such things in too much particularity. They might lurk in the backdrop in my novel, but I didn't want to bring them to the forefront. And the reason, well, it's not a political reason, it's more of an aesthetic reason for not doing so. And the aesthetic reason was this, that during the 1970s and the 1980s, that whole region of especially the Jharkhand coalfields, the Raniganj coalfields, Dhanbad as a district and so forth, gained a great deal of notoriety. You might recall that perhaps. It was all over the media, national media in fact, as the hub of, as you say, gang wars, of the coal mafia. But what I felt was that was becoming a bit of a stereotype. Right. So wherever I used to go elsewhere in this country, and whenever I used to say, well, I come from Dhanbad or I come from the Jharkhand coalfields, then they say, my goodness, how do you ever manage to lead a normal life over there? You have bullets flying around everywhere, don't you?
I was asked, how far is Wasseypur from where you live?
Wasseypur, yeah, absolutely. Now, so there was that, and there were the labor struggles, of course they were there, and the way in which coal miners and associated labor were treated, especially in the days of the private coal mines, was abhorrent, sometimes hideous. But once again, there used to be quite a lot written about that in those days, mercifully so. It used to be brought to attention, and the nationalization of coal mines put paid to a lot of that sort of thing. But at the time that I started out writing this novel, I felt that all of that was a kind of a stereotype that was being imposed on this place that I had grown up in and knew in many other different ways. There are so many facets to any place that one lives in. If, for instance, during the 1970s, if you look at the city of Mumbai, of Bombay, as it was then, and the films that were made in Bombay about Bombay. Now, the mafia was very, very strong in Bombay. The underworld was all present, all pervading, and yet it would have been very unfair, highly unfair for every Bombay film to have been a mafia film. So in the 1970s also, you had films like Choti Si Baat, Baaton Baaton Mein, which simply described the lives of people going about their daily routines.
And a song like Rim Jhim Gire Sawan, with Amitabh walking on the roads.
Quite right. Those are moments of great brilliance as well that capture the lives of people that are not being, that are not brushing against the mafia in any way whatsoever.
In fact, the next question is about the constitution of Vipul's universe. It seems to oscillate between two extremes. So he gets a heavy dose of realism at his school, St. Francis. And then it's also a place of wonder, of magic, as small town settings in India usually are. So there is एक स्वामी जी हैं पहाड़ी पर जो अंतर्यामी है, लखन नाई है जिनके पास एक कहानी है एक ऐसे नाग की जिसके पास नागमणि थी. So when you set out to write and to map Vipul's universe, what choices did you make? How did you go about identifying the constituents of this universe?
Yes,
because you had to filter a lot of things out.
Yes, in fact, that process of elimination, in fact, I've spoken about a little bit. I wished not to speak about the kinds of stereotypes that prevailed and get led into that trap, let's say. And then I had to exercise this choice of what to include. The exclusion had been done. Now, what do I now bring in? It can be, of course, tricky because there are infinite tales to tell. Any particular day that you pluck out of your own history or out of the history of a place has a novel in it, immanent in it, just like Joyce's Ulysses. So it's just the one day in the life of the protagonist there, which very often is thought to be bleak, very often is thought to be almost sort of despondency evoking, that sort of thing. That a child could actually find a great deal to marvel at, a great deal to thrill at, and in fact so much to explore, so much to take joy in, elemental joy. So even if it is just the coal and the dust, the coal dust which is in the title of the novel, in the eyes of Vipul, it's a nuisance, of course, because it keeps soiling his clothes, keeps soiling his skin and so forth. But then he's led to wonder about coal dust and the way that it keeps cycling around. Like the monsoon, it keeps coming into the house, you brush it out and the very next day it's back in and then it needs to be brushed out again. And Vipul starts to think, well, this coal dust has a life of its own, it has a mind of its own. And this dust is the revenge that the coal exacts for having been mined. You're taking me out of my habitat. This is how I'm going to bother you now. My dust is going to make your life miserable. Now, these sorts of flights of imagination don't often occur to adults when we grow up. We get a bit starchy about things. I think our imagination becomes constrained. We don't sort of have these leaps, I think, of imagination anymore, where we think of the coal as a living creature that has been dealt with in a particular way and is now exacting revenge through the dust. So I wanted that is what lay at the root of the choices that I made, whether it was the barber with the Nagmani, or whether it was this Panditji who does these forecasts through looking at teeth. What I wished to pick out was what really fascinated a child of, let's say, in their preteens.
In fact, the next question is about what you've just described. For decades now, books were driven by the themes they dramatized. And with this book, the spotlight seems to have turned on the elasticity of language, imagination, observation. Vipul is curious like all kids his age, but there's one subject which piques his curiosity more than anything else: language. He follows BBC broadcasts, he reads books, he makes mental notes of words, he has to look up a dictionary, and which in fact produces a very interesting reading list. कुछ किताबें हैं जो विपुल पढ़ते हैं. मैं चाहूँगा कि आप उसके बारे में ज़रा हमें बताएं कि वो कौन सी किताबें हैं जो विपुल पढ़ता है, जिससे वो भाषा सीखता है, जिससे वो इस दुनिया को समझता है.
You bring up a very intriguing point here, Gautam. Um if I may just reflect for a minute on what you said in the first part of your question.
Right.
Language.
Right.
And this attention on language. One thing I've tried to also do here is to say whether it can be any language. Happens to be English in this novel. It can be any language. But that also has a great deal of sensuousness to it. You know, certain words have a great deal of sensuousness to them. And that's why they attract us in almost an elemental way. We like to use them because of their feel on the tongue, for example. We like to use them because of the way they sound. They're euphonious, so very many of them. Because I was setting out to describe the sensory experiences of a boy, I thought that I'd bring language in this way as well. So there are, it's a voyage of discovery for Vipul. Language is a voyage of discovery and of sensuous delight, just as the rain or the coal or what have you in this novel. So that was one side of it. As to the reading list,
And also the sound of it. He can distinguish between a Soviet broadcast on shortwave and a Chinese broadcast and English broadcast. And
yes,
he takes an adjective to each of them.
That's right. And as to the reading that Vipul does, well, I would say that there are two facets to it. One is that much of it is underdetermined, if I may put it that way. That there is no real reading list that Vipul has, because he can't afford to have a reading list that he can tick things off on, living in the kind of place he does. There are no libraries around. There were no libraries around in those places, except in the school, and that was very tinily stocked.
But he's allowed to buy 3 comic books per week.
3 comic books per week was the allowance. But for that, Gautam, one had to travel 20 kilometers. And not on smoothly metalled roads. It was a journey by jeep, and then by boat across a river, and then by another car, and so on and so forth. So a complicated 20-kilometer journey just to be able to procure a few comic books. And then or let's say a book or two that you had in mind. Now, if the store in question did not have that book there that day, you had to wait it out for at least a fortnight, sometimes a month. There were certain sorts of books that never came to the coalfields at all. So you'd have to wait a year before you went to a city. We went on annual visits to Delhi, and I would wait and wait and wait the whole year until December would come around, go to Delhi, and then start looking for those books on the pavement markets there or in bookshops there. Now it once again is a matter of happenstance. Can you find the book that you've been waiting for all year at the point of time that you're there? Maybe not. So what do? You wait it out another year and so forth. And therefore, the kinds of books that you ended up reading, you wanted to fill your time in any case. Vipul wants to fill his time. Is anything you can lay your hand on is the operative phrase. Anything you can lay your hand on. And that's why you'll find that Vipul's reading is all over the place. You could call it eclectic, but it is not eclectic in a determined sort of way.
Is that the best way for a child to read?
I think there's a two-pronged kind of answer to that. I think it's a very good way for a child to read in the sense that it brings things to you that you would not otherwise have sought out. And there's a great joy in that. When things fall into your lap, and of course nothing is falling into one's lap here, but just again by force of circumstance, you're at somebody else's place and you happen to spot a book over there that seems very interesting, and you know that you will never be able to set eyes on that book again, so you plead to borrow it. You borrow it, you either like it or you don't like it, but it's never been on your reading list, but you end up reading it because you have the time, you don't have the books.
Right.
So you know
the closest bookstore is 20 kilometers away.
The closest bookstore is 20 kilometers away, and so in this way you get enrichment of different sorts. Your horizons widen out because you're not really being driven by your own likes also. On the other hand, what happens is, I said it's a two-pronged answer, because on the other hand, of course, what happens is that you spread yourself too thin, if I were to use that term, in your reading. You cannot be focused on, let's say, devouring all of Charles Dickens's novel. Charles Dickens figures in A Speck of Coal Dust. So the missionary.
I see a shade of that here too.
Perhaps, yes, thank you. Father Rockford, the missionary here, suggests Charles Dickens to Vipul, but how many of Dickens's books can you lay your hands on? And so if you can lay your hands on just the one, then that's your Dickens in your childhood. And then, you might have to just end up reading Hardy Boys next, Robin Hood next.
But the book is also about the constitution of Indian middle class in the pre-liberalization era.
Yes.
And you foreground its obsession with certain things, certain fads such as a tall, strong child, with English, with America, with health tonic Hamdard ka Safi. and we are constantly reminded of those obsessions in chapters such as the one where Mausi ji comes to visit Vipul's family in Khajuri, the chapter that deals with Swami ji, the chapters that deal with Vipul's school and his interactions with Father Rutherford. Yes. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I think that's a dimension of, again, life in those times that was at once sometimes oppressive, but then when you achieved a certain distance from it, also highly amusing. This obsession, for instance, with height, height of children in general, of boys in particular. And as I have said in the novel, Vipul is in a sense wholeheartedly subscribing to the whole thing, because he can't divorce himself from this reality surrounding him. So this anxiety to gain height, now what is it directed towards? It's directed towards being able to find for a boy the best bride possible in the future. That's something like 20 years down the line or whatever it is, or 15 years down the line. But it is imperative to set yourself on that path. If you're not naturally endowed with good height, you need to do something about it. So Vipul needs to do something about his lack of height, and he starts to obsess over it. He starts to do all sorts of tries all sorts of things to lengthen himself. Fails miserably, of course, because these things are genetically determined, and how can you just get your spine to elongate when you want it to? But there was not that sensibility in those days, not that sensitivity, nor that sensibility. And you were just, you could be openly derided, mocked for being short, as though it was something that you had willfully chosen to be. It says you're willfully choosing to be an alcoholic, and you're being mocked for that, or derided for that, decried for that. And therefore, there was this great neurosis about trying to gain height. And that's one of the kinds of things I've tried to depict in the novel is the sorts of social neuroses that existed, and how they
also around America, English.
America and English, and that neurosis is to do with finding a ticket to another world. In those days, for better or for worse, I suppose some elements of it still exist today. The English language was seen as a ticket into another world.
In the 90s, I remember a book called Rapidex English Speaking Course.
Yes.
Was a runaway hit.
That's right.
Kapil Dev would promote that book and
Yes.
say, Rapidex da jawab nahi. It also harks back to a time when perhaps it was possible to imagine a line of sympathy running from Dhanbad to Delhi and beyond to Lithuania and remote countries of Europe. When it was possible for Indian English fiction to choose a Mofussil as its setting and not feel uneasy about it.
I would concur on the whole, although I have a feeling that that sort of setting is making a comeback now. I think it's gaining a lot more legitimacy, if we can use that word. It's also claiming its own ground, let's say, once again. But yes, I agree that there was a phase when the urban and the hyper-urban took pole position, as it were, and eclipsed all other sorts of narratives. It was certainly easier to write this kind of novel around the 1980s and the 1990s when I wrote it, as you say. And you can look at examples of this kind, for instance, Upamanyu Chatterjee's English August. Now, those sorts of novels, I think, somehow captured the spirit of the time as well, because India was urbanizing very rapidly in those days, the 80s and 90s. There was tremendous urbanization. And I think people used to feel nostalgic about having lost touch with whatever roots they had, whatever touch they had with those zones that they had come from. Very often in those days it was first generation or second generation migrants, if we may call them migrants, that had come from these small places to the cities, and they still had this tug of nostalgia, tug of wistfulness for those places. I think what has happened then is that by around the mid 2000s, 2010s, it was, well, third generation, fourth generation people in the cities whose ancestors, in a way, whose grandfathers or great grandfathers had migrated. And those that had grown up in the cities never really would feel that tug, that emotional or that sentimental or that nostalgic draw back into the Mufsil regions. And therefore, I think it used to occupy less of the literary attention at that time.
So, although it's a book that doesn't pretend to do a sociological survey of that landscape, but it does deal with the teeming population there, with people who animate, add color or support life in industrial townships such as Khajuri. You have Aya, you have Thapa, you have Lakhand, Babar, and you also have a very entertaining character, Chavaniya Hero. And you portray all of them with great deal of sympathy without caricaturing them or without stereotyping them. And we've all come across such Chavaniya heroes in our own lives. Sikhiya Pahalwan, Bam Bahadur, Fokatiya Seth. Tell us about that.
Once again, it's a very nice pointing up that you have done of a particular kind of character in their own eyes and in other people's eyes. Now, this sort of character can exist in Delhi or in Bombay also, but they would be just laughed off, they would be written off. They would be too minuscule to pay any attention to. But they used to loom large in those smaller settings. And part of the reason they used to loom large was they used to appear to be very threatening.
Larger than life.
Larger than life and very menacing. Now, what I've tried to depict over here is that is someone who is very hard and brittle on the outside, but is actually soft as soap on the inside, as the story proceeds to, the episode proceeds to show. So physical fight, he gets beaten up in this story, as if you remember. He gets beaten up because of his outrageous behavior by a gang of these school-going boys. And he doesn't mind that, because that sort of violence is second nature to him. What he minds is something completely different. What he minds is that although his name is Rajna, these school-going boys call him Chavaniya Hero. That is to say, you know, as we say, gutter snipe, or the lowest form of hero, roadside Romeo and things like that.
Like Chandu Champion.
Chandu Champion. He resents that. He doesn't resent getting beaten up. In fact, he thinks that because he's been beaten up, it's taught him a lesson. He takes that in his stride. But this he deeply resents, being called Chavaniya, and then he goes to these boys and says, you know, why do you call me this name? It doesn't befit you to be calling me this name. You are the sons of mine managers. You know, it doesn't befit your stature to be. He appeals to their better selves so that they will stop calling him this particular name. So underneath this very tough and almost criminal exterior, there lurks this rather sensitive soul who can't take a nickname that's unflattering
for acceptance.
Clamoring, yes, absolutely.
Professor Manchanda, thank you for talking to us and for walking us through this magical world that Vipul inhabits in a speck of coal dust.
Thank you very, very much for having me here and for your wonderful questions. They were really so insightful, got me thinking about the novel in ways that I hadn't thought about it before.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, viewers. I'm sure you've loved today's episode and now you feel inspired to explore the coalfields of India, maybe revisit your own childhood and certainly pick up a copy of A Speck of Coal Dust. For more episodes, check out the Likhawat playlist on Sansad TV's YouTube channel and let us know your thoughts in the comment section. I'm your host Gautam Chaubey. Keep watching Sansad TV. Namaste.
To watch more programs of Sansad TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to like and share them.